Du Shenyan, in reply to Assistant Lu of Jingling's poem about early spring travels. Only we officials, always traveling, can be amazed like this at life's renewal. Pink clouds and white rising from the sea, plum blossoms and peach beside the spring river. Warming air quickens yellow orioles. New light warms green duckweed. Then I hear again an old, old song, and thinking of home, I dry a few tears. So we continue with poetry from the early Tang. The next three poets, Du Shenjiang, the author of this one, Shen Chuanqi and Song Jiwen, are very typical, very standard representatives of the early Tang Kung Ti Shi, of the courtly style, of the courtly poetry of this early period. So this poetry was a continuation of the poetry of the period of disunion, characterized by a very narrow range of topics. It was a courtly poetry. Lots of poems were written in response to other people's poems, or in response to a petition by an emperor or a member of the imperial family asking for an impromptu poem commemorating a certain social situation. So it had to be a poetry that was easy to spontaneously produce, which means it would probably be that most of these poems tend to be pretty conventional in their wording and in their topics. They adjust to quite rigid rules of metrical in constraints and rhyme and parallelism, but they feel, sometimes very empty or superficial, or, just not too serious. So in a poem like this, in reply to another one, it was common, for example, to imitate the rhymes of the poem that was being responded to, and sometimes a part of that poem was also modified or included in the poem that was the response to the previous one. And what else shall we say? Let's talk a little bit about Du Shengyang. Not much. So he is a 7th century poet. I think he died at the beginning of the 8th century. He was from an aristocratic family, and interesting for us, he was the grandfather of Du Fu, which means that, Du Fu didn't come up from nothing. He belonged to an aristocratic clan, even if it had declined during his own time. So this Du Shenyan passed the examinations quite early, and he was one of the favorite poets of Empress Wu Zetian, the empress that had been the wife of Gaozong and that tried to inaugurate her own dynasty during her lifetime and wield absolute power. So he was generally, a middle-low position courtier, like many of the highly skilled literary writers were. He suffered an exile after Wu Zetian's decline and was sent to near Hanoi in the extreme south of what was then the empire. And never quite liked those exotic places so different in climate and vegetation and in culture from his native China. So that's Du Shengyang, and what does he present to us here? So in line with the style of this early Tang poetry, this is a reply poem. It's a reply to another poem, and a poem by a person whom I do not know, but, well, it's an assistant Lu of Jingling, so another scholar official. He had written a poem about early spring traveling, so that's the topic that you have to imitate. And Du Shengyang made this, which is okay. You will see right now. It's pretty conventional, but not a bad poem. Pretty effective for its topic, even if a bit trite. So, what's the topic of the poem? It's early spring traveling. So the topics will be being absent, being away, traveling, parting. Although, this is not much developed, in fact, in the poem. It's more like the framing device, which is referred to in the first and the last couplets of the poem, basically through the sadness and melancholy of the poetic persona of the traveler, of the scholar official traveler in early spring. And it's also a seasonal poem describing the beauties of spring. I'm not sure I could say it has a parts, like most of these Liu Xi poems are too brief to be effectively divided into parts. Generally, in Chinese classical criticism, a Liu Xi is divided into 4 parts corresponding to the couplets. So, as if it were an animal, it's first divided into a head, a main body, and a tail, with the head being the first couplet, the body being the 2 central couplets, and the tail being the last couplet. And of course, by their mere positioning, the head is generally an introductory line that sets the scene, unless a prologue has already done that. And the last couplet generally, not always, but generally concludes the scene, tries to make for a satisfactory conclusion, and sometimes it makes a moral declaration or a moral summing up of the meaning of the poem. The central 2 couplets are the parallelistic ones. Others can be so, but the central ones have to be obligatorily parallelistic couplets, and they're generally the most descriptive ones, the ones that set the scene and describe things. So we could say that in this poem, the first couplet and the last couplet put the focus on the scholar official's reaction to spring. So in the first couplet, it basically says that the scholar officials who have to travel far and wide and who are getting older and older in serving the empire are the ones that most poignantly feel the round circle of the seasons. And so that's the first couplet. The central couplets describe these seasonal sights that so amaze and affect the scholar official. And the last couplet is the reaction to having seen all this, which is emotion. Oh, the poet is almost brought to tears. So let's go as usual, couplet by couplet. Only we officials, always traveling, can be amazed like this at life's renewal. So the first couplet clearly, quite squarely, situates the poetic persona as that of a scholar official. Scholar officials, as we've seen, and as from what we talked about Du Shenyan's biography, he lived it. Scholar officials had to travel around the empire, sometimes going from one province to another, and from one end to the and but still, that would mean that the scholar officials visit many provinces, see the seasons in different places. But why would they be only the officials amazed at the sights of life's renewal? So that's a bit of a paradox. Perhaps only the officials can be amazed like this because they travel through different areas with different climates. Perhaps, I don't know, for other reasons. I don't quite get why it's the officials that have a privilege in appreciating life renewal. So perhaps, you could think of different reasons. Perhaps while they're serving in office and becoming old, they contrast the eternal renewal of the seasons with their getting older and older in the service of the empire and not living lives of relative ease at home and with their family and friends. But, it wasn't only the scholar officials who had to travel around. Merchants also did that. But anyway, the first couplet positions the poetic persona as the privileged, sensitive person who feels the seasonal change, which is about to be described to us. And remember, this is a poem about early spring, so it will be spring elements. Pink clouds and white, rising from the sea. Plum blossoms and peach, beside the spring river. Warming air quickens yellow orioles. New light warms green duckweed. So here we get a catalogue of seasonal beauties. And I think even in the translation, it's pretty transparent. It's pretty easy to see the parallelism. For example, in the first couplet, so you have probably, I'm guessing, pink and white. The clouds are probably implied. And in the second couplet, you have plum and peach, probably the blossoms are implied as well. Plum blossoms and peach blossoms were supposed to be conventionally white and red or pinkish, just like the white and pink of the clouds in the first couplet. Rising from the sea beside the river. So, the parallelism is quite clear to see. So we have different images of nature. Beautiful clouds in the sea, beautiful flowers from peaches and plums by the river. So those are some of the beautiful sights of early spring. Also other sights, and again here the parallelism can also be quite clearly seen, I can think. We have birds, so orioles. It is believed that the spring came when warm airs came with it. So this general raising of the temperature quickens the yellow orioles as well. And this increase in light and heat also warms the green duckweed in the rivers or ponds. Duckweed is, one of those plants that grow over the water. So different images of spring beauty: colorful clouds, colorful blossoms, orioles, and green duckweed. Now the conclusion. Then I hear again an old, old song, and thinking of home I dry a few tears. So spring is not the season for melancholy par excellence in Chinese poetry. That's usually autumn. But still, any season, because almost all Chinese poetry is melancholy, it's very seldom celebratory, except in some of the court poems that, celebrate an imperial feast or a birthday and that were produced on demand. So, most of the poems of the scholar officials, lament, are melancholy. They complain about the passage of time, aging. And sometimes they make a contrast between the happiness or sadness that are typically ascribed to a season and the happiness or sadness that a person feels. Here a contrast is made, because spring is generally a happy season, a season of renewal and beauty and freshness, but it's sad for the scholar official. Why is it sad? He's thinking about home, he is missing his land, he's getting older, and he's also hearing an old, old song, which is not specified, but it's a sad song from the remote past, which probably reminds him, whatever the sad topic of the poem itself is, of his own mortality and of the passage of time. So the poem concludes with tears. After seeing these beautiful scenes, after hearing a sad song, the poem thinks of home and dries a few tears. He just starts crying a little bit, just a little bit. Okay, so this is the poem by Du Shenyan. This won't always be the case, but here I have another translation, also by Stephen Owen, from his book The Poetry of the Early Tang. And he gives the following version. Alone, men on official journeys are most startled by the renewal of things and the season. Rose and white clouds, the brightness emerging from the sea, plum and willow, springtime crossing the river. The clear air urges on the orioles, and the sky's light makes the green water grass coil. Suddenly I hear an old melody sung, and thought of return makes me ready to soak my kerchief with tears. So very similar to the other translation. Perhaps the emphasis here is on showing the parallelism more clearly. The first couplet, I think, becomes a little bit more transparent. Remember, the first version we read by Geoffrey Waters basically says that only the officials can be amazed at the renewal of life. This other translation seems to put the focus on the fact that the scholar official is traveling and alone is what startles him, what surprises him more about the renewal of things. So the renewal of life while he is going on his probably not excessively pleasant series of labors. But generally quite similar, one version and the other. So this is just a formal poem for satisfying a social situation, but I think it makes a relatively decent job at describing spring and at creating a beautiful and slightly sad scene.